Hello, I'm Alan Holtham. Welcome to this record bandsaw masterclass. Now, to me, a bandsaw is the most useful machine you'll ever have in your workshop. The only problem is a lot of people don't realise the true potential and buy a slightly inferior machine, not realising just what they can do with a bandsaw. Unfortunately, there's quite a few misconceptions about bandsaws. One is a lot of people think they don't cut straight. The other is they think they break a lot of blades. I hope by the end of this masterclass you'll see that these are totally incorrect. I'm going to show you how to set up the machine, how to use it, and how to enjoy its use. Now think about it, a bandsaw will do so much, so versatile. You can rip with it, which means you can cut long, thin strips off a board. You can cross-cut with it, either snipping pieces off the end of a board, or even cutting joints, like tenons. You can cut bevels with it by tilting the table. You can cut miters using the miter guide, although I must say on a bandsaw miters aren't particularly accurate. You can cut thin material, you can cut thick timber, you can cut metals, they have to be non-ferrous of course, you can cut plastics and of course a whole range of different types of timber. So it really is a most useful machine. The other good thing about a bandsaw is safety. Of course no woodworking machine is totally safe, they all involve cutting blades. If you think about it, with a bandsaw, all the forces are pressing down on the table. The blade is revolving like this, and it pushes the timber down hard on the table. On any other woodworking machine, you're actually pushing the wood into a cutter that is revolving fast towards you. There's always a potential for kickback. That's totally unlikely on a bandsaw, so it is very much safer. They're also quieter. When this machine is running, you can almost hardly hear it, so you feel quite confident about putting your hands close to the blade. But of course, always do be careful. But of course, the most useful thing about a bandsaw is its ability to cut curves and profiles. So if you're a cabinet maker, you can cut shapes on pieces of timber, and of course, if you're a wood turner, you can cut all your turning blanks. I'm going to be basing this masterclass on the BS300 machine, one of Record's most popular models. This particular one has an 8-inch depth of cut, which realistically means you're going to cut 6-inch material quite happily. But let's take a closer look at some of the details of a bandsaw. Of course, all these machines have two wheels, the upper main wheel and down below the drive wheel itself. Now if you're thinking of buying a bandsaw, there's a couple of really important points to look for. The first one is the frame of the machine itself. This needs to be really strong and rigid. If you think about a bandsaw, when it's running, all sorts of forces involved. You've got the dynamic forces of the wheel spinning round and round at speed, and then you've got the static forces. When you tension this blade up, the frame itself tries to squeeze together. The frame needs to be rigid enough to withstand that. Just have a look here, you can see how solid that is. That's not going to move anywhere. Really, really strong. The other important thing is the wheels themselves. On some machines they may be solid, on this particular machine they're spoked. It doesn't really matter. The main thing is they run really smoothly. If you take a close look, you can see these have been properly balanced with little wheel weights that have been stuck on. Really important, they run really smoothly. There are also a couple of controls on this top wheel. I'll talk about them in detail later on, but just for now, on the top here you'll see the tension control. By winding this knob, I can raise and lower this top wheel up and down, and that tensions the blade. Also on the back there's a tracking control. If I turn that knob, I tilt the wheel backwards and forwards. And that allows me to position where the blade runs on this top wheel. When I'm actually cutting with the machine, I want this blade to be somewhere near the middle of that wheel. As I say, we'll look at those in detail later on. Another very important feature is the table itself. This needs to be plenty big enough to provide loads of support when you're actually cutting with the machine. It needs to be nice and flat so the timber slides smoothly across it. It needs to be really strong as well. Just have a look at this one. Solid cast iron. This isn't going to go anywhere when you start dropping bits of timber on it. Really strong, really rigid. The rip fence is important as well. This slides easily across the table and locks with a single knob there. Nothing could be easier than that. And look how tall this is. Provides plenty of support. That's going to give us super accurate rip cuts when we start making long cuts down the grain. Now most bandsaws are supplied with a miter guide of some sort as well. This just slides from side to side like that for cutting angles. I must say, if you wanted to cut really precise angles, a bandsaw is perhaps not the machine for the job. You need to buy yourself a proper miter saw. But for work like tenoning or as a carrier for jigs, this is a really excellent feature. The table also tilts to 45 degrees or any angle in between, and that you achieve with a hand wheel underneath. Just come and have a look at this. Just release the table lock and then twist the handle there to set any angle you want up to 45 degrees, and there is a scale here you can see which gives an indication of the angle you've set. And when you want it back to 0 degrees, there's a little stop under there. I don't know whether you can see it. That makes sure the table sits back perfectly each time. I know that's spot on every time. Whilst we're on the back of the machine, just have a look at some of the controls I was talking about. On the top is the tension knob. Just by twisting this, I raise and lower that top band wheel, and that's what applies the tension to the blade. I'm stretching the blade between the two wheels. Also, is quite a unique feature on the record machines, is this cam lock. Just by releasing that handle, I take all the tension off in one go, and that allows me to change the blade very quickly and very easily once I've initially set the tension with the knob on the top. Also here, this is the tracking control. Release the lock, twist the knob, and now we're moving that top band wheel backwards and forwards, and that allows me to control exactly where the blade runs on the top band wheel. The other controls on the back here, the guides themselves raise and lower with this hand wheel. I just lower them down till they're just above the work and then lock them in place with that knob there. Have a look lower down. Down here we've got the main motor that drives the machine. On a machine of this size you'd expect it to be about 3/4 horsepower, 550 watts. Plenty big enough for a machine of this capacity. If you think about it, a bandsaw is only driving a very small blade. There's not much frictional resistance. It's not like a circular saw where you're driving a blade perhaps 8 or 10 inches diameter. There's a huge amount of friction to be overcome. So on a machine like this, a bandsaw, you don't need a huge motor. This will run quite happily off a normal 13 amp domestic supply. Just across here is a dust extraction spout. We're all becoming more and more aware of the dangers of fine dust, and a bandsaw does produce a lot of dust. So it is worth investing when you buy a bandsaw in a small extractor of some sort. They don't cost a lot of money these days, and what price really is your health? This is actually a 2-speed machine, and you vary the speed by changing the position of the drive belt on this 2-step pulley. You can see at the moment it's on the fastest speed. Just slip the belt across, adjust the tension with this idler pulley by turning the handle there. That's all there is to changing the speed. And you find for most jobs, just cutting timber, the faster speed is all you need. It's about 800 metres a minute. If you are cutting non-ferrous metals or plastic, you might want to drop it down onto the slower speed. The machine comes with a really good stand, really is stable. Just look at this as well. Press down my foot, the casters engage, and now I can angle the machine round anywhere. Really easy to move. Release the lock, machine goes down, and again it's stable. When you buy a bandsaw, there are a few settings you need to check and maybe adjust before you actually get using the machine. You want to make sure the blade is at 90 degrees to the table itself. You also need to make sure the fence is at 90 degrees to the table. And you also need to make sure the blade is parallel to the rip fence. Unless you check these, adjust them and get them spot on, there's no way you'll get the bandsaw to cut accurately. But most of these checks are initial checks only. Once you've got that right, it should be okay for a considerable time. You don't have to do them every time you use the machine. So we'll start by getting the blade at 90 degrees to the table. All you need is a standard square. Put it on the table, bring it up to the blade and see if you can see a gap. You can see on this one there's quite a big gap at the top. So I need to slacken off the table, screw in the adjusting stop, and now if I just tilt the table down, nearly there, just a fraction more, bring it down to the stopping gauges on the frame, we can now see that that blade is perfect square to the table itself. So I tighten up the locking screw there that holds the bolt in place. I can readjust the pointer to 0 degrees. I now know every time I come to use this machine, that blade is at 90 degrees to the table. The second check is to make sure the fence is at 90 degrees to the table. Again, use a small square, just bring it up, sight along it. You can see that's actually just a little fraction out. There is adjustment for that. Slacken off the fixing bolts underneath the fence. And now you've got a little bit of play up and down. Just bring that up until it's spot on. Tighten up the bolt. And lock it up with a spanner. Just check it again. That's perfect now. And finally, we need to check the blade is actually parallel with the fence. So again, use your square, bring it up against the blade, put it in a gullet of the blade itself rather than against the tooth, bring the fence up and make sure and check they are parallel. You can actually see this is spot on, there's no gap at all there. If you find it is out at all, just slacken off these two Allen screws on the fence. You can twist the whole fence assembly slightly and line it all up and then just retighten them. So those are our 3 adjustments. Of course, the acid test is will actually cut straight in practice, so you will have to make a few trial cuts, check them with a square and see how it all looks. Right, let's see what's involved in setting up a blade perfectly. So assume this blade is blunt and needs changing. Obviously we've got to take the old one out. So open the doors up, get them wide open, get them out of the way. Now we need to release this table locking screw. This just holds the 2 halves of the table together, stops them distorting relative to each other when you start putting bits of wood onto the table. Lower the blade guides down as well. That just makes it easier to get the blade past them. And now we can release the tension. Remember that cam lock lever on the back? If I just swing it over, you can see straight away how this tension is released. Once that's free, I can now release the blade, pulling it forward, threading it nice and steadily between the guides. Don't rush it, just take your time and feed it out through the frame. Pull it forward. You're now free of the machine. Maybe this is a good time to have a look at the procedure for folding a bandsaw blade. It's actually very simple, but I know a lot of people struggle with it. Everyone has their own way of doing it. My way is to hold it with your arms outstretched, your thumbs up, keep your left hand still, with your right hand just rotate your wrist, and as the loops begin to form, gather them together, and there's one neatly folded bandsaw blade. Let's just try that again. So we undo it, hold it out, arms outstretched, thumbs up. Keep your left hand still, your right hand just gradually rotate it over, get the loops together, just give it a little shake, the loops form equally, and now that will hang really neatly on your workshop wall. Much easier to store than the blade that's undone. Right, let's fit this onto the machine. Just undo it carefully. Now a lot of people don't realise it's actually possible to undo a blade the wrong way around. If you have a look at this one, if I put this onto the machine, you can see the teeth are actually pointing upwards. There's no way that blade will cut. It isn't welded up the wrong way around, which is what a lot of people think. All you have to do is turn it inside out. And now you can see the teeth are pointing the other way. Before you actually fit the blade, it's a good idea just to move all the guides back out of the way. You'll notice these side pressure guides are unscrewed adjusters. Slacken them off, pull them well clear of where the blade's going to go. At the back here, there's a thrust roller. This takes the pressure when you push the wood in against the blade. So again, slacken this off, move it back out of the way. You need to do the same thing down below. The side pressure guides are now on Allen keys, so slacken those off and pull them out to one side. Same on this side, just pull it clear. In this case now, the thrust roller is on a screwed adjuster, so just wind this back a little bit, again to get it well clear of the blade. Putting the blade back on is obviously exactly the same as taking it off. Just thread it through the table, between the guides, put it over the top wheel, through the frame, and you have to bend down a little bit, thread it between the bottom guides. Make sure it does go between the guides and not round them. It's okay at the bottom, just check it's on at the top. Looks somewhere near right. And now we can pull the cam lock on. You can see the tension come on straight away. Make sure that cam lock is right the way over. And now with your finger, just spin the wheel by hand a few times and let the blade settle down. And now we're ready to tension the blade up properly. Although this is preset on the cam lock, not all bandsaws have this facility, and it isn't necessarily the right tension if you change the width of the blade. If you put a different width of blade on, you will have to change the tension. So how do we set the tension? This is another one that seems to cause people no end of trouble. And it's usually they mess about with the tension because they're trying to get a blade to cut straight. And usually it's nothing to do with the tension on the blade that's causing it to cut off. It's down to the quality of the blade. Unless you use a top quality blade in the first place, no amount of messing about with the tension or the tracking or setting with the guides will make it cut straight. If you're struggling with a blade, it's cutting off when you're working against the fence. It isn't necessarily the tension, it probably isn't the tension, it's not the tracking, and it's not the way you're using it, it is probably down to the quality of the blade you've got. So it is really important that you start off with a good quality blade. So this is a good blade, this is a record blade we've got fitted in this machine, so we need to adjust the tension. Don't overdo the tension. Most people wind the tension up really high. You want just enough to stop the blade slipping on the wheel. If you overdo it, you'll end up crushing a flat spot on the rubber on the wheel, and you'll also stretch the spring that provides the tension here. So don't overdo the tension. You want to say just enough so that the blade doesn't slip on the wheel. I can just pluck that, I can hear, and I can adjust the tension by twisting this knob. On this machine also we have a little gauge, don't we? You can see this here. If you come in close you can see there's a gauge that gives us an indication for the correct tension. You can see as I change the knob, the pointer moves. This is only an indication. As I say, don't get too hung up with this tension business. It isn't that important, providing it is tight enough not to slip on the wheel. So I think that's about right. Once we've set the tension, we can now think about the tracking. What we want to do is try and get the blade so it runs in the middle of the wheel on the top. It's not precise, again it doesn't matter. This is the thing with a lot of settings on a bandsaw, nothing is critical. When we look at the planar thickness on a different masterclass, you'll see the settings on that are really, really critical. A thou accuracy makes all the difference. On a bandsaw, it doesn't really matter, provided you have a good quality blade. So we want to adjust the tracking so the blade runs somewhere near the middle of the wheel. You can see this is running quite a bit towards the front, so I need to move it back. If I release the lock on the tracking control around the back, remember we looked at that earlier, and what I need to do now, to make the blade move backwards, I need to tilt the wheel backwards. So I wind the tracking control in just a fraction. Don't overdo this business with the tracking control. Don't start winding it 3 or 4 turns. Just a minute turn, and then again spin the wheel by hand to let the change take effect. Still a little bit too far forward, so again I'm winding it in again, and again I spin it. You can see the blade has just moved back a fraction. That's probably near enough. It hasn't got to be slap bang in the middle. And also, one other thing you'll notice, if that's in the middle on the top, it isn't necessarily in the middle on the bottom wheel. Don't worry about that, as long as this top one is somewhere near the middle. As soon as you're happy with the tracking control, just lock up the knob on the back. We now know it's tensioned correctly, it's tracked correctly. All we've got to do now is set the guides. And again, this is another area that seems to cause a great deal of problems. What you want to do is to get the guides so they are just clear of the blade. Again, it isn't that important that they are 5 thou clear or 10 thou clear. They want to be just clear. And you can quite easily do that by eye. You don't have to mess around with feeler gauges and spend hours setting it up. Once again, if the blade is good, it will cut true. And I'll show you later on a cut with no guides in place at all, and it'll be spot on. The guides only really come into their own when we're cutting profiles or curves. So I've set those two by eye. Again, now I need to do the same on the bottom. Just bring them in. Probably the easiest way is bring them in until they touch the blade, and then just back them off a fraction and tighten up with the Allen key. And again the same on the other side. Bring it in till it touches the blade, just back it off a fraction. It needs to be just clear of the blade. That's tight. Now the thrust roller is the next one. So what I want to do is set that, bring it forward, it's just clear. And again, lock it in place. The Allen key. Same again underneath, except now we've got a threaded adjustment. Just wind that roller forward. Again, it's just clear. And now once again, I'll lock it up. Now something else I haven't mentioned, but is really important, when you set the thrust roller, you want to make sure it is in such a position that when you apply pressure to the blade with the timber, the gullet or the teeth on the blade cannot go between these side pressure guides. These side pressure guides are hardened metal. If those teeth go between the side pressure guides, you'll knock the set off instantly. At no time must these teeth, see the teeth there and their gullets, go between the blade guides themselves. So you want to make sure the thrust roller is in such a position to stop them ever moving far enough back to get between those rollers. I say one touch on those rollers, the set of the blade will be gone and the blade will not cut straight. As soon as the set's gone, the blade will start cutting off at an angle. So hopefully that's all set up now and we can make a few trial cuts. Before we do that though, one important point, it's very easy to forget, replace the table locking bolt, just keeps the two halves of the table level, keeps them nice and flush. There's quite a bit of confusion about the bandsaw blades themselves as well. If you look in the manufacturer's catalogues, they list all sorts of different sizes, different widths, different tooth patterns. Don't worry about that, it is actually quite simple. I've got quite a collection of different blades here. If you look at them closely, you'll see they vary in width and they also vary in tooth pattern. A machine like the BS300 we've been working on will take all these different widths of blades. So what are they all for? Obviously the tighter the radius of cut you want to make, the narrower the blade you use. So down here we've got a 1/4 inch wide blade. You'll notice though it's got quite a coarse tooth pattern. This is actually 3 teeth per inch, what we call 3 TPI. This one is a little bit wider. This is a 3/8 wide and this has 6 teeth per inch, 6 TPI. 1/2 inch one, but this is much finer. This has 14 TPI. And on this side we've got the widest blade this machine will take, a 5/8, 4 TPI. Now as well as the number of teeth per inch, so there is another little confusion that's added, you can vary the tooth pattern. This particular pattern, the 4 TPI, you'll notice has quite a wide gullet, quite a wide gap between the teeth. This is skip pattern. A skip refers to the width, the distance between those teeth. And with a skip pattern blade, you find it will cut quite a lot quicker. The finish you get straight off the blade won't be quite as good, but the cut will be quicker because that gullet will clear the swarf very much more quickly. For the majority of work, something like a 6 TPI skip pattern is ideal. The narrower blades you use for the tighter curvature. If you're onto very thin materials, ply or MDF or non-ferrous metals or even plastics, you might want to look at something like this one, which was a 14 tooth blade. This has what we call a regular pattern. The gullets are much smaller, the gap between the teeth is much smaller. This is regular pattern. So if you're confused already, I'll just recap. The main blade you want for the majority of work you'll do is a 3/8, 6 TPI blade. And then also think about buying yourself as a standby a 5/8 wide 4 skip blade for those deep ripping straight cuts. Right, I've gone on quite a bit about the quality of the blade you have. It is important that you buy a good quality blade. Now how do you tell if it's a good quality blade? Can you look at it and see? Well, to some extent you can look and see. There are a few pointers to look out for. First thing is to look at the join itself. Obviously a bandsaw blade is made up from a continuous strip which is just butt welded together at the ends to make it into a continuous loop. Notice the join here. Rub your finger along it. Does it feel smooth? Can you feel a definite bump there? You shouldn't do on a good quality blade. That should feel almost continuous. Run your finger along the back as well. That should be nice and smooth. No step, no jump there, otherwise you'll find it'll bang as it goes through the guides. When a blade is welded up, two pieces here, the ends are brought together and butt welded. On a good quality blade, that join should be nice and straight like that. On the poorer quality blades, the alignment is obviously sometimes not as good, and you get, slightly exaggerated obviously, you get that sort of effect where there's a definite bow in the blade. And when you try and run that on the machine itself, you'll find the blade will surge backwards and forwards as it's running through the guides. It'll knock bang, bang, bang as it goes through those guides. Eventually it will spoil the guides. So you need to take a poor quality blade like that off and swap it for something that's a little bit better. I'm often asked, of course, how long a blade lasts. Very difficult to say. Obviously depends how much you use it. There are a couple of symptoms to look out for. As the blade dulls down, you'll obviously have to start pushing harder to get it to cut. Also, you'll find if you're doing ripping cuts, the blade may start pulling away from the fence. Do remember, the blades do need replacing on a fairly regular basis. Don't think they'll last forever. Very, very rare to actually break a blade as the machine is running. These blades are 25 thou thick. They're a thick blade. It is very, very unusual to break one of these while the machine is running. But just occasionally it's worth, if you've had a blade in for a while, just have a quick look at it. Look out for any cracks or anything that's likely to cause problems. You notice on this particular blade there's a little crack developing there. This is most unusual. It does happen very, very occasionally, and quite often it's not because the blade is old, it's often because the blade has been over tensioned. Well, remember when we're setting up the blade, I talked about not over tensioning the blade. This is another symptom of putting too much tension on a blade. Now, once the blade is in place, there's something else you can do to try and make it cut a little bit better. If you're cutting a lot of curves, I do a lot of wood turning bowl blanks, if you're cutting a lot of curves, particularly with a fairly wide blade cutting tight curves, you may get a little bit of burning. And this burning is caused by the back of the blade, not actually by the teeth themselves. And you can improve this by dressing the blade. And what you do when you dress a blade is to hold a stone, this is a diamond lap, hold a stone on the blade as the machine is actually running. So this blade is spinning. As it's spinning, I'm holding this diamond lap on the back. What I'm doing is taking away those two sharp corners. I'm putting a radius on the back of the blade, and that makes a tremendous difference, and it will get rid of a lot of this burning effect that you see on this blank here. Fortunately with a bandsaw, there's very little you have to do in the way of maintenance. We've already covered the procedure for changing the blade when it does eventually dull down. But one other thing you can do with a blade is to give it a good clean occasionally. This is particularly important if you're cutting a lot of softwood or resinous woods, which tend to clog up on the blade. You find the area behind the teeth gets clogged up with resin, and that will affect the cutting performance. A good way to get rid of all this is to put it in an old bowl, get some oven cleaner, just give it a good spraying all over. Just leave that to soak for about half an hour or so, and then wipe it all clean with a cloth. It's amazing how that will restore the cutting performance of the blade. Back to the machine itself. The only thing really to look after is the guides. Remember, these are bearings. You've got bearings on the sides and a bearing on the back to take the thrust. Just give these a spray over occasionally with some silicone. Just helps lubricate them, make sure they stay free running. And while you've got the silicone in your hand, just give the table a good clean, wipe it all off, and again give that a nice spray over with the silicone, and you'll find that will make a huge difference to the way the timber slides on the table as you're working. On the table also, you need to regard the table insert as a consumable item. This will eventually get worn, particularly when you start making profile cuts. You'll twist the blade and this will get cut. So just occasionally you may need to replace this. They are available as a spare part. Now then, the other thing is to look at the wheels themselves. The band wheels are perfectly fine, they will last forever. Just occasionally though, you may get some damage to the tyre. If the blade snaps, on a very rare occasion it might snap, or if it starts skidding on the tyres can become a little bit chewed. But again, these are a replaceable item. The other thing to check on the wheel as well is this little brush. This is designed to keep the band wheel clean. Again, useful if you're cutting resinous timbers. Just adjust it, make sure it is in contact with the wheel at all times. And that's all there is to maintenance on a bandsaw. Very simple, very straightforward. Now at last it's time to actually make some cuts. And as you can see, we've moved into my workshop. Before we start though, just a quick word about safety. Whenever using the machine, always wear safety glasses of some sort, really important. Always use a push stick if there's a chance of your hands ending up near the blade. And finally, always connect up the machine to a dust extractor, just take away some of that fine dust. The first cut I'm going to make is a straight rip cut. And this is really just to dispel the myth that you can't cut accurately with a bandsaw. Just watch this, you'll see. I've got a piece of hardwood here about 2.5 inches thick. I've set up a 3/8/6 TPI blade and the guides are all set correctly as we've seen before. The first thing to do is lower the guides down until they're as close as possible to the work and then lock them up tight on the back. Put on your glasses, start the machine up, making sure the wood's well clear of the blade. And now just feed it very gently into the blade, constant pressure. Don't force it. You can see we're getting a nice straight cut. Look at the thrust roller on the back of the guide. See how that is spinning as the blade is pushed against it. Keep the pressure nice and constant. Don't force the cut. When you get near to the end of the cut, replace your fingers with a push stick and just carry right through. There we are. Look at that, perfect. I think you can see you can cut accurately with a bandsaw. If you're still not convinced, just watch again. I'm going to bring the fence really close to the blade and try and take off a veneer thickness. Lock it up tight. Same procedure again. Nice steady pressure. Try and keep one constant movement. Don't keep stopping and starting as you're pushing the timber through. There we are, constant veneer thickness. I think you can cut accurately on a bandsaw. Do you remember earlier on I talked about how important the guides were, or more importantly, how unimportant the guides were, providing the blades in good condition? Now just watch this. I'm going to make that same veneer cut without any guides whatsoever, just to prove the point. I'm going to back them right away. Look, no support whatsoever there. Bring the fence up again for a really fine cut. Lock it up tight. Let's see what happens. Remember, we've got no guide supporting that blade and it's cutting perfectly through. Nice steady pressure. Keep the timber moving at a constant speed all the way along. Nearly there now. Just relax the pressure slightly as you get towards the end of the cut. There we are, there's the veneer. Look at that. I think that proves the point, don't you? And now for something completely different. I'm going to show you a deep cross cut using the same 3/8/6 blade and then cut a turning blank to illustrate the profile cut. Raise the guides up again and set them so they're just clear of the timber. Watch how easy this cuts through, what must this be, 5-inch material? Nice steady pressure again. Don't force it. Just relax the forward pressure a bit as you get near the end of the cut. Look at that, perfect cut, perfectly straight, no distortion, 5-inch material. Now we'll cut the profile. It's usually best to start cross grain. Sometimes it's awkward to use a push stick here, so you might have to use your fingers, but do be careful. Come in across the grain, start twisting the blank round. Now you can get your fingers well clear. Constant pressure, turning and pushing forward at the same time. Be careful where the blade might emerge through the side. You'll always find it cuts much more easily when it's going across the grain rather than down the grain. Keep twisting. We'll move those pieces out of the way. And the final quarter, just start it with your fingers and then replace with a push stick. There's our perfect disc in 5-inch material. Now I've used a 3/8 blade for all the cuts so far. The width of the blade really determines the radius of cut you can make. If I reset now on a piece of slightly thinner material, I can demonstrate the problems of using too wide a blade. We've made a diameter cut there of about 5 inches. A 3/8 blade will cut quite happily 4-inch diameter stock. Just watch this. See again how much easier it is across the grain than down it. Keep your fingers well clear. That's a 4-inch diameter blank. You do 3-inch with a 3/8 blade. Notice it's going round. You're not stalling the blade at all. It's cutting nice and freely. Nice constant pressure. Twist at the same time. Now, that's probably about as tight as you'd theoretically go with a 3/8 blade. You might get away with something about 2 inches diameter. Just listen to this, but you may hear the blade start stalling. Did you hear that? If I go a little bit too tight, you hear the blade slowing down. If I'm going to take this sort of curvature, this radius of curvature, I really need to go back to a 1/4-inch blade. Just a little bit too tight. You can hear I'm struggling to get round the corner. Never mind, we were nearly there. And you can see we've used a 3/8 6 TPI blade. We've cut a big diameter in really thick material, and we've cut a really tight diameter, all using the same blade. Cabinet makers will find a bandsaw really handy as well. There's always profiles to be cut, as well as the straight stuff we've already seen. Look at this, for instance. This is a pediment off the top of a cabinet. A nice, smooth curve. This is a piece of cake for a bandsaw. There is, however, one snag. If you look closely, you'll see there's a blind cut here. We can't get round that in one go with a bandsaw. So before you make any profile cuts, have a good look at the cut, plan ahead a bit. We're going to have to put in a release cut to allow us to work either way. Let's see that in action. As before, lower the guides down so they're just clear of the table. Make your release cut first. And now we can put in the profile. Keep the timber moving forward as you turn it round. And now the other curve from the other end. When you're planning the cut, remember you do have a definite throat distance. So just rehearse the cut before you start to make sure you've got enough room to swing the timber round. There's our perfectly cut profile. The bandsaw is perfect for a joiner as well. You've already seen a variety of different cuts. There's something else you can do. You can make simple joints. Say for instance you wanted to cut a tenon on the end of a piece of timber. Perfect job for the bandsaw, combination of a rip cut and a cross cut. Make the rip cut first, set the fence to cut the exact width you want. Just feed the timber in, nice steady pressure again. Now, you can make the cut by eye as you've just seen, but if you've got a whole series of these tenons to cut, you can use a stop. Very simple to set up. It's a piece of timber and a clamp. Fix that to the fence, the length you want the tenon to be, and now when you make your next cut, you just push it in until the wood stops against the wooden stop we've put on the fence. Very simple. Repetition cutting made easy. Now we've got to withdraw the timber from the blade. Always be careful when you pull it back. This is called backtracking. Providing the blade is set up correctly and is running somewhere near the middle of the wheel, there's no problem with that whatsoever. But just be careful as you draw it back. Now we can turn the timber over, push it in, stops against the stop we've set up, and we now know both those tenon cuts are exactly the same length. What we've got to do now is make the shoulder cut. Take the stop away, and now we use the rip fence in conjunction with the mitre fence. So I replace the mitre guide, make sure it is set on 0 degrees, we want a nice straight cut, and now set the rip fence to be the length of the tenon. Set that spot on, put it back up against the timber, and that now acts as my length stop. Nice and steady, don't force it. First cut made, turn the timber over, up against the fence to get the same length. And there's perfect tenon. Wasn't that easy? Now, as well as cutting straight with a mitre guide, you can obviously cut mitres themselves. You can set any angle you want. Say I wanted a 30-degree angle on that piece of timber. I set 30 degrees on the scale, lock it up tight, and now just push the timber through, making sure you hold it really firmly against the fence. There is a tendency when you're cutting angles for the timber to creep along the fence a little bit as you make the cut. So make sure you hold it really firmly. Now, again, quite straightforward. We have a super accurate angled cut. Don't forget the table tilts as well, so you can cut bevels or make compound angles. Just watch this. Slacken off a table, tilt to the angle you want, lock it up tight, and now just push the timber through in exactly the same way. Keep a firm hold against the mitre guide and feed it nice and steadily. There's a compound angle. So far, we've made all the cuts with just the one blade, the 3/8 6 TPI. We've cut thick stuff, we've cut thin stuff, We've got straight, we've got profiles, we've got bevels, we've got miters, all with just that one blade. I did say you wouldn't have to change too often. Just occasionally, however, you will need to change the blade to suit a different application. In this case, I need to cross-cut some pieces of corian, which is a plastic material. The 3/8/6 TPI is far too coarse for this for a normal cut, so what I'm going to do is swap it for a 1/2 inch 14 TPI blade, and that will give me a much smoother cut. Before I do make any changes to the blade whatsoever, before I start messing in the machine, the first thing to remember, of course, is always to remove the plug. Another application where you might need to think about changing the blade is for resawing. That's the process of cutting deep ripping cuts in a log or solid timber. You can see here I've got a piece of yew which I've resawn into a series of thin strips for box making. I'm going to show you how to do exactly the same thing on this log of laburnum in a minute. But you can use the same principle for square edge timber. It's a piece of oak here about 1.25 inches thick, too thick for what I need, so I can resaw it down into 2 thinner strips. And for this I will need a wider and coarser blade, something like a 5/8 4-skip blade. I'm halfway through changing this blade for a wider one. Before I go no further, just come and have a look at this. Very important point. When you change the blade for one of a different width, you will need to adjust the position of the guide holder. See, it moves backwards and forwards. So because I put a wider blade on, I need to move it forward. So again, the side bearings are just clear of the gullets. Normally, if you change one blade for another of the same width, you won't have to make this change. But if you change it for one of a different width, always check that the guide bush holder doesn't need pulling backwards or pushing forwards. So I just need to lock that up tight now. And I think we're going to be ready to go. Cutting logs on the bandsaw is quite straightforward. There are a couple of things you need to be aware of. The first, you've got to get the log stable somehow. If I put that directly on the table, it's going to roll about, so I try and push it through and will snatch. So put a flat of some sort on one face. I've done this on a planing machine, or you can use a portable planer. Once you've got that flat surface, when you put it on the table, it is nice and solid. The other thing to remember is you should never cross-cut a log on a bandsaw, even with a flat. There's always a tendency, if you try and cross-cut against the blade will snatch it and roll the log. If it doesn't crush your fingers, it would kink the blade. So never ever cross-cut logs on the bandsaw. Right, we're ready to do our straight cut now. I'm going to use the rip fence initially just to give me a bit of a guide. Got the flat face firm on the table, and I can make the first cut. Again, feed in exactly the same way, nice and steadily. Notice how I've set the guides to be just clear of the work. Again, using my push stick, let the timber cut in its own time. Nice and steady. Nearly there now. That's the first cut. We've now got 2 good flat faces. I can set the width I want for my boards and just continue ripping them down. So you just keep ripping off strips until you've got exactly what you want. These are perfect for box making. We've managed all those cuts easily. That's mainly because I'm using a new sharp blade, and that is the key to using a bandsaw. The blade must be in good condition. There are one or two symptoms to look out for if you think the blade is dulling down. For a start, the quality of finish you're getting won't be quite as good as you expect. Another symptom is when you're ripping. If you're using the rip fence trying to cut a nice straight piece, as you push the timber through, it may pull away from the fence and you end up with a tapered piece. That's nearly always a sign the blade is blunt, or probably more likely, you've knocked the set off one side of the blade. And that's usually because you've been cutting a lot of discs or profiles. The wood turners will be aware of this. You cut lots and lots of blanks and you're working just on one side of the blade all the time. You remove the set on this side of the blade only, and then when you try and start make a straight cut, it wanders off. If you are cutting blanks on a regular basis, save one blade only just for blank cutting. Put a new fresh one in when you want nice straight cuts. A couple of other things to look out for as well. First one is barrelling. Instead of being a nice straight cut, you often find the cut is that sort of shape, a barrel shape in effect. That again is usually down to the blade being blunt, and you then start forcing the cut to make it cut. It can also sometimes be caused because there's not enough tension on the blade, so do check that as well. Another one is washboarding. You can see on this piece here, see these ridges here at a slight diagonal angle. That's called washboarding, and when this happens you usually hear a screeching sound from the blade as well. It's a vibration, and that is always caused by the insert around the blade. You can see the soft insert there around the blade. That drops fractionally below the height of the table, and you don't get even support at the cut. Just pack that up if it is too low. And that's all there is to it really. I guess the bottom line is the cut will only ever be as good as the blade. Put a good blade in, change it regularly, you'll have no problems.